if I'm very honest with you, something wrong with you. I had maybe a wrong definition of high performance.
If you're climbing the mountain, you're feeling, why am I doing this? And then finally, when you get to the top,
Don't get comfortable in that.
success can sometimes be the enemy to progress.
What makes you say that? One of the best ways that we figure that out is sometimes not from what we discern ourselves, but actually from
Hey everybody, welcome to the Human Exchange, or THX for short, a platform where we want to discuss everything performance, potential, and purpose in a real, raw, and relevant way across our professional and personal lives. Here at THX, I am interested in talking to humans, not just experts. And today I have a really cool human. His name is Leon. You've probably seen him. You probably know of him because he looks really familiar. If you don't, then, well, where have you been? But Leon, I want to jump straight into what we are going to be talking
Let's
about.
go for it.
What is a high performer? Can you eat it? Is it a snack? What's a high performer? What's high performance? How would you define it?
Well, I mean, for me, the proper answer, having now, I think, had a lived life with having the wrong definition of a high performer, I think I have arrived at the thesis that a high performer is someone that lives life, and it's not necessarily career driven, but I think it's someone who conducts their life anchored on a strong sense of purpose. And when you've got a strong sense of purpose, then someone whose actions then show a sense of purpose, or whose actions merely become an overflow of being very convicted on that one thing. So I think that's what a high performer is. Later on, we can talk about maybe some of the pitfalls of where I think I had maybe a wrong definition of high performance.
Yeah, I like that. Anchoring on purpose and making sure your actions are aligned to that. And I think just to give our listeners also a little bit of context, one of the reasons why I thought of this topic, the dark side, or talking about high performance, is I figured that I think for most people, we are interested in success, achieving success. And I kind of work backwards, right? So if you want to achieve success, how do you do that? And I've kind of like then surmised that, okay, if you want to reach success, you gotta have high performance, and to have high performance, you gotta be a high performer, right? So, example would be if you're working in a company, what success? Success is getting a promotion, climbing the ladder. So then they would distinguish: are you a high performer or not a high performer? That's how they use that basis to promote you. So you got very you gave a good perspective to that, right? Where in order to get to that high performance, you got to have purpose. And arguably, maybe some of us, our purpose is to achieve that kind of success. So how do we discover that? How do we define our purpose? Is success for success sake a good purpose? I don't know. What are your thoughts? How do you help define? What are some good questions you can ask yourself if somebody is trying to find their purpose so that they can align themselves to?
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing is, first litmus test is, does the pursuit excite you? I think that's one way of defining it. Does whatever that pursuit is give you a sense of excitement about the task at hand? And then on a practical level, I think it obviously has to be in line with either some sort of experience that you bring, whether it's lived experience or career experience. And then thirdly, I think it has to align with skills then. And I think naturally you will develop skills by virtue of experience. And so I think when you have those things, then that gives you maybe a semblance of an idea that might potentially be your purpose. But we were just kind of chatting off camera earlier about how you were drawing a distinction between, and I love it. I've never really thought of it this way, but he said you were saying that actually with high performers, you have high performers that operate from a stance of being a go-getter, and then you also have high performers that kind of operate from a kind of exploratory stance. And for me, we were just discovering that I am more of an explorer, and so I think for me, how I have stumbled upon a sense of purpose has been through just trying different things. And sometimes I would say that that's the encouragement for if someone is naturally a go-getter, then great. I mean, I sometimes feel it's a gift to have that, because you are just naturally predispositioned to finding that one thing, locking in early on. But then there are some people that I talk to who say, but I don't know what I'm supposed to do. And so I think for me, to people like that, I would say, well, then just try different things. And, I think if you try enough things, but with half a mind of figuring out the thing that you will then zero in on, you're more likely to stumble on something and then discover your purpose. I think sometimes purpose is something that is developed as opposed to predestined. We're both Christians, so I think there's often this wrestle, because obviously we believe that God also does give us a purpose, but we also have free will as well to determine in what way does that purpose play out? How does that manifest in our lives? And so, for me, that looks like exploring, but then having a bit of a framework as well, so that you're not just left, in a perpetual state of exploring and then never finding your one thing. But at least it's one thing to just kind of get you started on that journey.
Yeah, wow. So if I were to kind of like summarize what you just said, it's like, to find your purpose, you have to first look for something that makes you come alive, your passion, so to speak. But then you got to also have that skill sets, whether it's inborn or natural or developed. I mean, even if it's naturally gifted, is in something, you should also develop it, right? So those two things. But then you mentioned that I like this thing where you mentioned you have to try a lot of things to sometimes discover what is really your thing. And I find that a lot of people are not willing to do that sometimes. They're not willing to go out into the familiar. In fact, they rather stay within the familiar, even though they could be absolutely hating it. And they give themselves a lot of excuses not to try new things, meet new people, gain new experiences. Why is that? Do you think is it a mindset thing, or what's stopping people from really trying stuff? I don't know. What do you think?
I think just basic human behavior. I think people are naturally, even if you say you like change, I think if you're very honest with yourself, I mean, I'm someone who I would say that I like change, I like a new challenge. But if I'm very honest with myself in how I might feel at the point at which that challenge is posed to me, in that split second, I think the honest reaction would be, oh wow, one of being maybe a bit averse or hesitant to step into it. And then it takes you 2 seconds to reorient, and then you think, actually, no, I think that's going to be an exciting thing to step into. So I think naturally humans probably don't like change. It's obviously nice to be in the comfort of your home or in the comfort of a job that you know well, even though you might not see any sort of potential growth in that job. But it's comfortable. It's the reason why people like sitting on their couch watching Netflix, because it feels good to be comfortable. And there's also, I think, there's value in comfort as well. I think one can't perpetually be in a state of trying to find that uncomfortable thing. You need to also have spaces. But I think it's being intentional about that balancing act, and also knowing when is too long to be in your kind of comfort zone.
As you were speaking, a thought came to my mind where I think people are self-preserving. All of us have this mode of self-preservation. So we want to protect ourselves. So trying new things means we expose ourselves to the risk of rejection, failure, disappointment. So it's like if you were to, like this podcast, for example, I think we had many months ago, we had lunch, and then you were already doing a Game of Impossible. I think that was right before the whole thing just really exploded, right? And I remember you were encouraging me, hey, why don't you try something as well? And I gave you all kinds of excuses. Nah, I don't think it's my season, blah, 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 blah. But if I were to be really, really honest, I think there was that part of me where I fear rejection, right? Where I fear that, okay, if I did this, what if nobody watched it? What if nobody likes it? What if I don't get the kind of response that I anticipate or I expect to get when I put in effort into something? But I find that many times in life, I had to actually intentionally combat that kind of limiting belief, where I have to ask myself the flip question. No, what if people actually liked it? Wouldn't, and one of the things I subscribe to is I rather look back and go, at least I tried, than look back and go, man, I wish I tried. So I think that's very insightful, right? You just inspired me to think about that. That hey, we need to reframe the narrative sometimes, and it's true. A lot of people are stuck with questions of I don't know what's my purpose, I don't know what's my passion, but are you putting yourself out there? Immersing yourself in new experiences, new environments that will give you new inspiration and new information that will then actually surface more and more things. Like, for example, I transited from a non-commercial organization into the commercial world. And if you ask me back then, I would be like, no, I don't think I can do it. I have no skills. I don't think I'm interested. That's not for me. But when I made that shift, I discovered like, whoa, imagine all the things that I would have missed out on if I did not make this transition. I mean, what I learned from back then, my previous background or my previous history, yeah, it's valuable. It shapes me to who I am today. But that shift, one of the best decisions I made, because really, instead of asking what might happen, you should ask what actually could happen, what good could come out of this. So I think that's really important. Yeah.
It's a lot easier to deal with I often say this, it's a lot easier to deal with the sting of failure than to deal with the chronic ache of regret of having not done something.
I love that. Yeah. You mentioned a framework because we talked about how you are a bit of an explorer. You kind of like to dabble in a lot of things, check out a few things here and there. And then you have some kind of framework or outline that you would be able to then discover or check boxes. Okay, this is something that I think I want to focus on. Maybe share with us a little bit. What kind of framework or what questions do you ask yourself to clarify whether this thing is for you or not?
Yeah. I mean, maybe to bring it to life, I will apply that to live case, which is essentially how we started the Game of Impossible podcast. That podcast was the product of an idea of an exploration into something. So, for 3 years prior to producing it, it was an idea. It was something that I talked about, and I always told my wife, I'd love to do a podcast. At that time, the reason for it, and it still is the reason why I enjoy this format, is because at the end of the day, I still feel like I'm always a storyteller first, and so I enjoy listening to other people's stories, and also enjoy trying to understand how different people think as well. So I had that as kind of the overarching sort of sense of what I thought was a purpose. But then I realized that I sat on that idea for 3 years, because to me, I think that was an obvious sign that I don't think that was quite the purpose yet. And so then I started to think, okay, how do I then define a more compelling why for doing it? And so then I think I landed on the first principle, first criteria, which is the outcome of doing this going to be so compelling that you would do it even if nobody was watching, even if nobody paid you to do it. So I think that's the first thing. It's got to be something that's something that excites you so much that it doesn't matter whether anyone listens, whether it does well, but you do it because you just simply enjoy doing it. So that's the first thing. And so I figured, well, how do I find that? So I explored different types of formats. I explored a format that was more just kind of me speaking to camera, sharing different things in the week. I said, well, I think at some point I'm probably going to get a bit tired doing that. Either I'm going to get tired of doing that, or the audience is going to get tired of seeing me just talking to camera all the time. And so that's when I landed on, you know what, actually, maybe one way that would help me to enjoy this, regardless of whether it does well, is to bring my dad into the picture. Now it gave me a greater sense of purpose, because regardless of how this podcast does, even if we only had one audience, one or two captive audience of my mom and my wife, I would still show up every Friday to do it. Because beyond that, what does this mean? Well, it means that it's a space for my dad and I to connect with one another, for us to connect, but also for me to be able to learn. So then that clarified the sense of purpose. But obviously, I needed to now think of the next level. So as we started to do it, we had to ask ourselves, actually, at what point do we stop this experiment? Because obviously there could have been a case where it doesn't go so well, and we've got other jobs as well, other things that we have to do. So we have to be wise about our resources. So that compelling sense of purpose. Then the next thing was, are we actually good at this? And so we gave ourselves a 3-month period to see what would be the rate of improvement as we upskill, because it's something that we had both never done before. My dad barely even knew what a podcast was, So I had to, because there was another party, I had to also make sure that I was managing his expectations of this. So, what would be our skill level? And for us, because we were venturing into a new thing, it meant how quickly are we going to be able to skill up and develop in our skills in doing this thing. And then the third thing is interest. What's the response going to be for this thing? So in whatever it is, whether it's a business venture, you've obviously also got to be grounded in reality as well. You can have an idea of, an ideal kind of business or service that you want to sell. You can even have the right people on board. You can have all the right skills and structures to make this business go well. But then ultimately, if there is no interest in that thing, and if it's not serving people, then actually it becomes purely a self-serving exercise. So then the third thing is whether or not this is something that other people will benefit from as well. Is it serving your kind of hunger to want to pursue this thing that excites you? Are you also demonstrating skill or demonstrating some sort of pathway towards getting to that skill level? And then I think thirdly, it has to serve people. And I think that's what we have found in doing this platform, is that, for us, to be honest, it started from maybe more of a selfish place of just wanting to spend time with one another. But I think the real blessing was figuring out that actually in us doing this, other people were benefiting beyond just the kind of business principles that we talk about and leadership principles. But I think the unintentional secret sauce for us was that because it was a father-son interaction, there were a lot of people that were benefiting from that dynamic, either because they lived through our platform vicariously, because maybe they don't have a great relationship with members of their family, or they do, but this gives them maybe some insight into how they can continue to kind of establish good relationships, good dynamics with their parents. So I think for me, it's those three criterias. If at some point you get to a point where actually you're not meeting those, then it's probably worth thinking, maybe I should pivot and try something different.
Wow. I'm a bit of a structure kind of guy, so I like to summarize and categorize things, right? So your points are all spot on, and if I were kind of arrange them, I would say the first thing is, you mentioned regardless of the outcome, will it bring you joy pursuing this thing or starting this thing? Meaning, at the end of the day, are you happy if you're happy with it? The kind of thing, right? You're doing it and you can go, similar to what I said earlier, you can at least say, well, at least I've tried, right? With no regrets. So does it bring you joy? Will it bring you fulfillment at the end of the day? Whether there is success or not, it's something that you go, okay, I've done it, right? So that's the personal aspect, the personal satisfaction aspect. The second thing, I think you mentioned community. Is there a group of people that would come around you? They don't have to be a large group of people, because you mentioned for you, even if it's just the audience of your spouse or your mom, right? You'll be happy, right? But I think that really translates to how important community is. There's this saying, right? People use it in team buildings and all that all the time. If you want to go fast, go alone, right? But if you want to go far, go together. And I think community is so important. So if you're starting If I were to make it practical, if you're studying like a business or if you are pivoting careers and all that, finding the same like-minded type of people would be really, really encouraging and really helpful. And the last thing, you talk about value. I think whenever that we start something, we want to start small, but we want to progressively track whether are we delivering value. And value comes in different forms, right? So if you are in a business, value will be seen by how many customers are you continuing to get, because that's what money is. People pay for what they perceive to be the value of that thing. Same as salaries. If you get a promotion, if you get more pay, it's not because you are just doing more work. It's because you're delivering more value. And that's why you get higher pay and all that. Many people don't seem to understand this distinction, right?
Yeah, and it's true. And I think when it comes to building teams, that's often the difficult thing to navigate, because I think a lot of organizations, they promote on the basis of time spent in the organization, or promote on the basis of volume of work done. But those things, they're good measures of whether to promote someone, because obviously time spent shows that someone demonstrates loyalty. So those are good character traits. And obviously, volume of work done shows a certain level of drive, discipline, and diligence in the work. So obviously, those are good things. But you can also run into the problem of hiring people or promoting people who maybe don't necessarily have the leadership skills to then move on to becoming a manager. Those are two very different things. To be a good contributor versus being a good leader.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And so many times I've personally been on that side as well, of having been promoted maybe a little too early in my career, and operating as a high-performing contributor while having the title of a manager. And I've seen the problems of that. I don't think I was leading well, because in those seasons I felt okay, I was remunerated, I was promoted because of my individual contributions. Now that I'm a manager, rather than changing the mindset and thinking, I've now got to figure out how to get the best out of the team, I took it as, now they're paying me more money, now I need to do more work. And I thought I was doing a great job, because I thought, hey, like now I've been promoted, and now I've leveled up, I'm working even harder, I'm doing all of this. And then when it came to doing my 360 review, I realized, wow, why are all my scores so poor? Then I started reading some of the feedback, and people were saying, well, Leon kind of has a tendency to hoard the work, and he doesn't take time to kind of coach us through things, that he has a tendency to just kind of take over. If things are taking too long, he takes over, and that diminishes my growth as a team member. And so I think that distinction is important. Value versus just amount of work done.
Yeah. And what you mentioned is also very, very common. A lot of people, they misunderstand output and outcome. That's one thing. But also when you move from an IC, individual contributor, to a people manager, as an IC, you are in charge of delivering results. But as a people manager, you're in charge of delivering results through people. So the type of skill sets start to shift and evolve. You still need to have that technical expertise in the work that you're doing, in the industry you're in, but the human skills of coaching, inspiring, empowering, that is something that it's not easily, it doesn't come naturally to many people, and it's something that has to be developed. But that's also the pitfall of someone who's a high performer. You're so interested in the results, so you want speed. And it's true. If you want to, there's this saying, if you want something done right, do it yourself, right? But if you want something done fast, you end up also doing it yourself, because it takes longer. It's a longer route, coaching somebody, teaching somebody, versus just doing it yourself. But that's something that to be to be mindful of, I think, especially for those who are of us climbing the corporate ladder. If you suddenly find yourself in a position where now you're a people manager, you really have to shift how you are trying to deliver your results. I want to kind of switch gears a little bit. So we're talking a lot about passion, right? In discovering your purpose, you have to know your passion, what brings you joy, what brings you satisfaction. But let me kind of flip the script a little bit. Is passion alone enough? Is it overemphasized? Because we've come from, we're both millennials, right? So our generation was sold the idea that, you should just pursue your passion and then the money will follow, But along the way, I think life has proven that is not always true. And of course, some people also ridicule this statement saying that, well, this is pure rubbish, right? But what are your thoughts? Is passion the only thing? Must you really enjoy the thing that you are doing? I don't know. What are your thoughts around that?
I think passion, usually the word passion is associated with a sense of excitement, and it's seen through this kind of rose-tinted glasses. But it's why I always return to the word purpose, because actually you can have a sense of purpose for something, but something that you don't necessarily enjoy the kind of the outworkings of. So, for example, I look at, I work in a church, and for a long time, and if I'm very honest with you, even today, there are things about the sort of responsibilities of working in ministry that I don't like. But I do it because there's a higher purpose to it. So I think sometimes the problem with the kind of passion narrative that people have in terms of whether it's a job is that you end up expecting that everything that you do in that job is going to make you feel happy. Yeah. But happiness is fleeting. So if you rely on something that is fleeting, you might actually be in the right place, but because you're looking at things through that kind of fleeting feeling of happiness, you're more likely to potentially give up too soon on that task. And you would know as well, there's so much beauty and value in sometimes just sticking through something. There's value in repetition. And sometimes I think we do ourselves a disservice if we don't allow ourselves enough of a gestation period to repeat that thing over and over again, and to get better at that thing. And also to go through a bit of a grind. Because actually it's in those kind of moments of being in the valleys that is actually where growth happens. But if you're constantly chasing that kind of mountaintop experience, that's not very sustainable. And you're going to find yourself very, very frustrated when things don't go right. Which I think is probably, if you're honest with yourself, things not going right, especially as you climb up in leadership, is probably 90% of your experience on the job is things not going right. You having to then, as a leader, problem solve for your teams, for your stakeholders, etc. So the short answer to that is I don't think that passion is necessary as a starting point. What I tell people a lot of times, if they're especially if they're earlier on in their careers, is that you've actually got to sometimes look at it practically. Of course, in an ideal world, you would start off on something that really, really excites you, that's completely in line with your hobbies and stuff. But realistically, people have bills to pay. So I would often say, hey, do whatever is gonna afford you an opportunity to get started and get work, because sometimes you discover that thing might end up becoming your sort of passion, or you might discover a sense of purpose in doing that. But also sometimes it's helpful to be able to do stuff in order to define what you don't want to do. So I think that there's value both ways as well. So I always say, start with whatever it is that you can add value in. Like you talked about value earlier. So you've got to be good at the thing. You've got to be good at the thing, and you've got to be able to see that this thing that this kind of value that you add will be helpful for the organization, for your clients, for your customers as well. If you can start with those two things, then sometimes the purpose thing can come later on.
Yeah. I'm going to pick up what this phrase you mentioned. Don't just chase mountaintop experiences. What many people tend to forget also is that to get to the mountaintop, you have to go through the valley first, and that's that takes a lot of effort, and that requires perseverance. And that's the thing about effort. I've learned this thing, right, that many of us associate effort as expertise. What I mean by that is that if we think something comes to us effortlessly, that means we are good at it. But we actually become experts or masters at things through practice and through failure, through trying again and again. And if we don't shift our thoughts around how we view effort, then that we get into that bind where we may have an interest in something, but then because it requires effort to get good at it, we go, oh, this must not be for me. And then people then give up. People then say, oh, it's like math. Like full disclosure, I am terrible at math. I'm not a numbers person. Another kryptonite of mine, Microsoft Excel. Whoever who created that, God bless and curse his soul at the same time, right? But I've learned that when I'm doing it, it's terrible. I hate it. But as I become better and as I start seeing results, I start having that sense of satisfaction, that sense of joy even. I'm not happy, but at the end of it, I get that joy because I go, wow, I see the results of my effort. Kind of like how if you're going through the valley, if you're climbing the mountain, you're feeling, why am I doing this? And then finally, when you get to the top, the view just blows you away. You go, wow, this is all worth it. So that's a form of like, experts call it dopamine hacking, right? Because we are so used to the instant gratification, but there is effort in that. There is value in the grind, in the persevering, and in the putting in effort. So I think that's really, 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 really important.
Yeah, and I mean, just going back to that mountaintop analogy, in a simplistic way of looking at it, if you were to climb Mount Everest, right? You climb the mountain, you get to the top, it's inspiring, like you say, and you feel this, probably never climbed it, but I would imagine you'd feel a real sense of euphoria, and it's probably a life-changing experience. But you wouldn't exactly want to stay on top of Mount Everest forever, would you? You'd waste away after after a certain time. You die on top of the mountain
you go
top.
up there, you go, okay, that's it. I'll take the picture. I'm coming down now. Yeah.
And why is that? Because we say from a leadership standpoint, there's no growth on the mountaintop. But just in real life, that is how it is as well. At the mountaintop, the air is dry, the air is thin. You're inspired, but there's no nourishment, that there's nothing for you. The valleys they're uncomfortable places. Sometimes it's frustrating to be in the valley when you're in the pursuit of the mountaintop. But in the valley, that's where there's growth, because there's personal growth as you are sort of finding your way through tricky terrain. But there's also growth because there's resources, right? In the valleys, it's resource rich. You've got water to draw from. You've got food as well. And so, often what I like to encourage our teams is that if we feel that we're in kind of an uncomfortable state, it's a good thing. We should be spending 80% of our time in that kind of state of wrestling and being in a valley, actually. So we should start to encourage people that is actually normal, because those are the things that will not only shape us, but those are the things that will also sustain us on the journey as well. And of course, you can't only stay there, because if you only stay there, then that's where morale just completely dips. But you've got to be there, but with a view to encourage your teams that you will eventually get to the mountaintop. But then once we do get to the mountaintop, don't get comfortable in that mountaintop. Find a way then to find a second curve, a new journey to another peak, another summit.
Yeah, find another mountain.
Exactly.
Because on that note, success can sometimes be the enemy to progress, not necessarily failure all the time. Because once you reach a certain level of so-called success, you can get comfortable, you can get complacent. So in your opinion then, should we always be chasing the next mountaintop? Then now we've climbed Everest, should we climb, I don't know, the moon or something? You can't climb to the moon, but you get what I'm saying. Should we do that?
This is something that I'm wrestling with personally. My natural answer to that is yes. We should always be we should always be aiming for the next thing.
I sense a but there. Tell me about that but.
But the but is, how do we ensure that we are doing the right thing, and that we are not simply aiming for progress for the sake of progress. I think for a lot of my career, and I think sometimes that still is a bit of a natural tendency that I have to be aware of, is I think for me, there's often this default setting of wanting to achieve stuff in order to prove a point. And it was the reason why in 2019, 2020, I experienced burnout for the first time. And I don't want to, I'm hesitant to use that word lightly. And so I often say I experienced maybe a form of burnout, or what I think is burnout. And so what did this look like for me? It looked like suddenly getting to a point of not being able to do very simple tasks. So on a practical level, I found that even writing a simple email would take me up to 2 hours to do, something that would normally be able to do in a matter of seconds or even minutes. Suddenly took a very long time. And then the other thing was, I found myself all of a sudden very kind of very numb to things. Like people will share, news of somebody passing. And it's not to say I didn't care, but there was still a kind of like this sense of numbness about just general things that were going on around me. And suddenly finding myself being very cynical. And so that's when one day my wife said to me, she said, "Leon, I think you should talk to someone about this." I was like, "Yeah, I can talk to you about it." She was like, No, I think you should talk to someone and seek some sort of professional help." And I don't know, at that time, I was one of those who was guilty of maybe trivializing or downplaying actually the importance of therapy, professional counseling. I almost thought that for me to concede that I need professional help was to say that I had an issue, that there was something wrong with me. But after a long conversation, I decided to do that, and I decided to seek therapy, and it was quite eye-opening, because when I sat down, I started to share some of these struggles, and as I did, I was going into it. I kind of had my preconceived notion, or almost a self-diagnosis. So as I was speaking, I would say, yeah, it's probably because of this, it's probably because of that. And what I kept saying was, I think a lot of this stems from a sense of an elevated sense of worth. And so then the therapist stopped me and she said, "Actually, no, from what you shared, it's actually quite the opposite." I said, "What do you mean it's the opposite?" She says, "You have something that is called automatic negative thoughts." I said, "What does that mean?" She said, "In everything that you do, you operate from the assumption that you are not good enough." And so I challenged her. I said, "But how can that be if my prevailing thought is generally that I need to show people that I'm better?" She said, "There you go. You said you need to show people. The fact that you feel you need to show people, even though you tell yourself that you are the best, you are better, but the fact that you feel you need to show people, you're obviously trying to prove a point, and that has to stem from somewhere." And so she said, what we need to do, or what you need to do, is not necessarily to reduce the amount of work that you're doing, but to rediscover a real sense, the proper kind of anchoring in why you do things the way you do. So for the exercise that we did sounds very rudimentary and very basic, but actually it was really helpful. And so she made me take out a piece of paper, and then she made me draw 2 columns. So on one column, basically it starts with the statement. So we will go through a list of statements. So let's just say, for example, the statement is, Leon is not an effective leader. Okay, so that becomes the statement. You would then have 2 columns. One column would be all the hard evidence for why that statement is true. Then the second column is all the hard evidence for why that statement is false. And the key word here is hard evidence. Because when we started doing that exercise, then I started filling in quite a few parts. Oh, this is easy. Like, I think this is a true belief, because I started filling up the column with all the evidences, or at least what I thought were evidences for the statement being true. But as we started to go through that, she would then ask me, okay, what makes you say that? Did someone else say that to you verbally? Oh, actually, no, they didn't. Right. So then that's a theory. You're hypothesizing that people have this impression of you. And so as we started to filter down that list, then what happened is I probably had one piece of evidence that might suggest that I was an ineffective leader, but I had a multitude of other evidences suggesting that that statement wasn't true. And so for me, it was having to do that exercise to reorient myself, to do things not from a place of trying to prove something to someone, but to do things simply because I want to achieve that key sort of purpose. And so that's, I think, how I try to at least discern now. Once we've achieved one mountaintop moment, if we're going to think about going to the next one, going through that kind of exercise, am I doing this because I want to prove a point, or am I doing this because I genuinely feel that at this stage it will probably be beneficial for both our teams but also our kind of stakeholders that we progress? And if it's going to be value added for them, then it's worth progressing.
I think it's a given that in order to have high performance, you need a lot of energy, right? So you need a lot of physical energy, but a lot of people don't see the fact that you also need a lot of emotional energy. So as you were sharing that burnout and the symptoms, where you find it really difficult to accomplish just a simple task, or you find it, you feel numb. That to me shows a depletion of emotional energy, and they're both closely interlinked. Physical energy and emotional energy. I mean, we're all one being. You can't separate us emotions from the physical, right? And you need to have enough emotional quotient to keep going. Because when we talk about that intentionality doesn't come from flexing your literal biceps, but it comes from flexing your emotional muscles. And I think when we reach a space where we have drained all our emotional banks, drain all our emotional tanks, that's what happens. We're told to present our best self at work. You're not supposed to be emotional. You're supposed to be professional, right? But in order to put up that front, put up that performance, you're actually consuming emotional energy. So I thought it's important for people to know that you have to keep your emotional banks full. You got to take care of your health, your physical health, yes, but you got to make sure that your emotional tank is filled as well, so that you can keep going. And I think that's very, very important. And going through the therapy exercise, one thing I've also discovered is that our thoughts form our emotions. It's not the other way around. People tend to tackle the emotions on its own, but it's actually the thoughts behind those emotions that's driving it. So like you mentioned, if you have this thought where I'm not good enough, that feeds you that emotion of like, well, I'm going to just that I'm going to keep going, that persistence that gives you the energy. But the thing fueling that energy is kind of like not a real positive thing, it's a negative thing. So after a long time, that's not sustainable, and that you can end up in a very bad place, and then you leave this thing called collateral damage of those around you. Have you ever has that? What are your thoughts around that? Like your drive or your ambition then affecting those around you. Have you any thoughts or experience around that?
Yeah, I mean that example again. The collateral damage of that is the team under me suffered because I think that was a really big leadership learning for me. Because what I didn't realize was, like you say, your thoughts inform your emotions, And then out of that, that then informs your actions. And sometimes when you're in the thick of it, you don't realize, you might think, oh, these are just kind of internal thoughts that I'm having, but they eventually start to manifest in the work that you do. So for me, what that ended up looking like was leading from a place of insecurity. So, if like I mentioned earlier, sometimes I think I used to have tendencies of wanting to just kind of do more. And I think in that season, when all of those things were heightened because of the insecurity and all of that burnout, it made me want to hoard even more. And so those things for me just made me even more ineffective as a leader. To my bosses, it might not have played out as obviously, because most of what they see is the outcomes. So the outcomes were still great, but I suffered as a result, and then more importantly, the team suffered as well, because I was leading from insecurity. But once I was able to kind of flip that, like I mentioned, it didn't necessarily mean that I had to become less effective. It didn't mean that, in order for you to address burnout, you've got to do less. Actually, in some ways, you could argue that we ended up doing more after I had course corrected. But it was from a positive place, because for me, as a leader, then I was doing things not with the need to prove a point, but doing things purely because I felt that they were the right things to do. And I think when you're convicted on the right thing, your teams are able to smell that. And so for them, then they were more on board with what we needed to do, because they said, well, actually, this seems to be coming from a good place. Our manager is excited about the task at hand. And so naturally, I think we're quite excited as well. And so let's play ball. But also to your point on managing emotional energy, the bulk of your job is going to be dealing with negative emotions, whether it's your own or whether it's your team's. There's just going to be a lot of problem solving and firefighting that you end up doing on a daily basis, right? So those things are hard enough as it is. And you can't control those things. Those are stuff that are outside of your control. But what you can control is the amount of emotional energy that you spend on maybe internal things that don't need to be there. And I felt that was what was helpful about doing this kind of therapy thing, because as and when I start to have negative thoughts now, I just run it through that system. So that doesn't mean that I'm now completely free from having negative thoughts. I still have them, but I'm just able to kind of deal with them a little bit quicker, so that I don't end up expending so much of my emotional energy on me. And I've now got more to spend on really spending time with our team, even with my family. Actually, most importantly, saving up resources to be with my family first. And to be honest, that's something that I'm still trying to be, I think, more adept at, to be honest, because it's something that I always talk about. And for my wife and I, we're so passionate about marriage. We love journeying with married couples. But the reality is that sometimes when we take a hard look at ourselves, and I'm not speaking about her, but if I take a hard look at myself, sometimes in the pursuit of high performance, it can be very easy to drop the ball on the home unit. And it's funny, right? Because we often say that, to lead well is to lead your household well first. It's easier said than done. And for me personally, that's something that I have to put a lot of intentionality around. So one thing that has helped us to do this is to just kind of accept that actually life is not supposed to be a balancing act. We often talk about work-life balance, but balance assumes, if we assume a fixed fulcrum, in order to have balance is to ultimately split your energy and your resources 50-50. So my argument is that if you are aiming for balance all the time, you're not going to be the best husband, nor are you going to be the best performer in your work or whatever your vocation is, because you're splitting yourself this way. And also what you will find very difficult is that naturally there are going to be things that will happen that will tip the scales. So maybe you're in a season of, there are some family issues that you have to deal with. Maybe you're going through a loss at this time. So naturally, that's going to start swinging the scales this way. But if you assume balance, you're going to find yourself really, really struggling whenever the scales tip. So what one of my pastors used to say to me was, change the frame. Don't aim for balance, but aim for harmony. And so I asked him, what does that mean? He says, well, if you feel like the scales are tipping in one way, shift your fulcrum. Shift your fulcrum to that side. And that's how you stop things from falling apart. Because what that does is that means that now you've got full permission to put more energy into the thing that requires you a little bit more. But then to be discerning enough to know, okay, I've now spent enough time here, things are settled here. Be skillful enough to know how to shift your fulcrum accordingly. And so how that has played out for my wife and I is that we have, started to do this weekly exercise of meeting together. And we figured we do WIP meetings with our team and they're effective. Why don't we do it at home? And so we started to do that. Of course, there are weeks where we can't, but we try as best as we can to do that every week. And when we do that every week, what we do is we pull out our calendar and we start talking through the different things that we need to do and communicating ahead of time, trying to figure out what are going to be seasons where work is going to be exceptionally busy for her and for me, so that upfront we can already tell each other, okay, for these seasons, this is when I'm going to have to spend a little bit more time here. But before we do that, we also then agree immediately after, how can we put aside time to intentionally make up for lost time? So sometimes this can look like booking a holiday ahead of time to say, okay, this is a really busy project, but as soon as this project ends and we've already got a date for it, immediately 2 days after we go on a holiday together. We call it family revenge. So for everything that takes you away from family, how can you identify those pockets for family revenge? And vice versa as well. If you feel like, okay, now we've spent a lot of time with family, how can you then also iron out pockets with your work and be very clear with your teams? Okay, this is where you have all of my focus and attention.
Hey everybody, I want to take a break from the conversation we're having to tell you that this episode is actually sponsored by Medicos. Now, I'm not the type that usually wears a mask, nor do I like to, but whenever I need to, I go to no other brand except Medicos. Why? Because it is the most comfortable and it offers up to 3 times more protection than any other mask you will find in the market. On top of that, they've got a great range. They've got my favorite here, Slim. They've got some for the kids, Junior. They also have a hijab range because they have your comfort and practicality in mind. You can find their mask in all major pharmacies, Watson's, Caring, Allpro, as well as their Medicos online store and their e-commerce sites, Lazada and Shopee. Now, back to the episode. Yeah, it's great. And as you were talking, my mind's also thinking, and I kind of landed on 2 thoughts in regards to what you were saying. First is, you mentioned it's very easy to, in the pursuit of high performance, to dedicate yourself to your work or whatever, and then neglect your home. In that aspect, I think it's about recognizing short-term, long-term. You got to have both, right? It's not about balancing, but you got to have integrating harmony, right? Short-term and long-term. Short-term things will always feel more rewarding in the short term. Meaning, if you are putting in a lot of effort at work, you're getting the recognition, you're putting a lot of effort in your business, you're getting the progress, you're getting the sales, you're getting the leads in. So that's fulfilling, right? And then if you don't do that, the short-term effect also is evident, right? So maybe your boss speaks to you a certain way, or you're not getting enough revenue in, that's short-term. But long-term is also important, because when we spend time with our family, when we invest in the relationship with our children, with our spouse, you may not see the immediate returns yet, especially if your kids are young, right? But you may experience it later, or maybe even pay for it later for the lack of attention that you give them. So I think we've heard numerous stories of people who have worked really, really hard in their younger days, but in their older days, their children either want to have nothing to do with them, or they have very poor quality relationship with them. Same with the spouse. So I think it's about recognizing this. I'm actually speaking to myself as I say this, where things that we do for the long term, with family, friendships, we may not experience the immediate ROI yet, but the long term dividends or effects will come into play. Because once the sun has set on your career, on your business, who's going to be there? Who's going to be at the end? And you want to make sure that whoever is left at the end actually hold you in high regard. That's one thing I would say. And I think the other thing I would say is building capital to create margin. What I mean by that is, I love the illustration of not focusing on balance, but creating harmony or finding integration. Because when you are at work, you should be performing and delivering so that you build capital, so that when there's a time where you need to withdraw from work to invest in your personal life, you've created enough margin for people not to punish you. And it's the flip side as well. If you spend time with your family, your wife, your kids, your parents, your siblings, whoever, quality time, like you're actually fully present with them, you're invested in them, you are creating capital so that when you actually need to go away for the business trip, or you need to really focus on that project, or that really need to close that sale and you need more time, you've created enough margin for you to depart from that area to this other area. And it's all, again, about the intentionality and how much you're giving. I think the danger of sticking to that balance is like what you said. You end up not giving enough to either, or you give barely enough, which doesn't give you enough margin, right? So a very practical example would be, if you are a high performer at work, you deliver, you don't just meet expectations, you exceed them, on numerous times, and that gives an impression now. Hey, this guy, boleh pakai lah, in our language, this guy, he can do the job.
Yeah.
So when there's a time where you need to actually excuse yourself, people will go, oh, that's cool, because we trust him. But on the flip side, if you're somebody who, only just gives the bare minimum or doesn't even deliver what's required, and then you suddenly need to withdraw, then the margin the social margin, the perception margin that you have to play with is much lower.
Correct.
And I think that's so important. So important for us to recognize, whether you are a business owner, whether you are a professional, if you're a family man, we got to build that. We got to understand short term, long term, but we also need to be very intentional to build capital, to create margins for ourselves in the times that we need to shift.
No, I like that. I've never seen it that way, but it's true. And I think what a helpful frame as well, because it means that when let's say you've built up enough capital and therefore enough margin for, let's say, your work, it means that now when you're spending time with your family, you're not dealing with the sense of guilt. Yes. You talked earlier about managing your kind of emotional capacity as well. When you're carrying a sense of guilt with you, that weighs quite heavily, which means that even if you are spending time with your family and you've already blocked this in the calendar, but you've not addressed the sense of guilt, then you might be physically there, but actually it's not very helpful for them either, because if you're not mentally there, then that will also show, and that will impact how you are during that time, which I think ultimately can end up negating that period that you set aside because you're not there. But I think if you've kind of established enough kind of capital on the work side, and now you're with your family, you know that you can be fully present because you know that things are covered, and you don't have to deal with with the thoughts of what will my team think while I'm on holiday with my family. So great, really good.
Let's go back to that mountain illustration, right? So I asked you a question. I asked you, do we need to chase the next mountain, right? So you mentioned that we went down this whole trajectory of talking about some of the dangers or some of the things you need to manage. I want to ask, what is there any danger if we don't chase the next mountain? What if we decide that, hey, we've kind of like arrived at our career, at our business. I think this is a good place. I'm going to set up camp here. Things are going well. Why introduce disruption when there is no need, seemingly no need to? Why rock the boat? Let me just settle here because I'm doing great. I'm doing well. I don't know. What are your thoughts?
Yeah. I've often kind of struggled with that. So I think for a long time, I think similar to you, the thought of not kind of going at something 100%, it used to trouble me, but I also used to end up kind of almost judging other people who maybe operated at what I would label as a mediocre level. But I think I've since changed my thinking around that. Because I think so what I've been focusing again on is purpose. And so my stance is, well, if not going to that mountaintop is fulfilling not just your collective purpose, but not just your personal purpose, but the collective purpose, and if the whole organization is aligned that now is the time to just be comfortable and that there is no need for us to go at the next level, then more power to you if you decide let's take it easy for now. But ultimately, it has to be aligned with everybody else, because I think if you, as the leader, decide I want to take it easy, but if that's going to now come at the detriment of your team's growth, and they've expressed that they would like to continue to soar to new heights, or if you sell products and your customers are looking for that new release, they're looking for that new iteration, and you're not fulfilling that, then obviously that's not good either. But if across the board, all three, there's no real reason to change and it's just business as usual, it's probably going to be the best way for the business to run, then I would say, yeah, absolutely, stay the same. It goes back to purpose. It has to be, as long as it's aligned with purpose. And so I've just come to the conclusion as well on an individual level that for some people, in order to live a life of seemingly mediocre life, if that is their purpose in life, then I actually feel, wow, well done to you, because you're doing the thing that you set out to do. That's your pursuit, and you're doing it. So as long as if we set a pursuit and if we're doing the thing that we're supposed to do, then I think we're operating in our purpose. And then it doesn't have to matter so much what that looks like, whether it looks like grinding, whether it looks like not really doing much. As long as people are aligned with their purpose, not just them as individuals, but the people around them, then all good.
Yeah. You invoke and you inspire me to think a lot. So like as you were sharing, I was also just thinking, it's before asking whether we should climb the next mountain, maybe we should enjoy the one that we're on now. It's taking the time to enjoy the one. And I'm speaking to myself again, because I'm the kind of guy that once I reach the peak of a certain mountain, I'll be like, okay, cool, nice. Everybody got your pictures? All right, let's go to the next one, And it's about actually being able to slow down and enjoy the moment. And I think that's where I think people need to also be rewarded, and we also need to be rewarded for our grind and our hustle, and just allow each other to enjoy the fruits of our labor, so to speak. But I'm also thinking about how we live in such a volatile and dynamic world. If you've been on that mountain, you know what's going to happen. Somebody else is going to climb up that mountain, followed by another person, and then not long you're going to realize, man, this mountain is crowded because more and more people are climbing on them, and inevitably, what people are going to do is going to push you off the mountain to make room for them to be on it. And I've seen that in a lot of people. So recently, about a couple of months ago, I was hiring for a position. It was just a AM, assistant manager position, but the amount of overqualified candidates that applied kind of, it was a bit of an eye opener for me. If, in a few ways. One was that um, as I looked through some of their resumes, one of the reasons why they were overqualified was because they had like 20, 25 years of experience, but I was only really looking for 6 to 8. But when I looked at the 20, 25 years of experience, I saw that they were essentially doing more or less the same thing. Their job title may have been a bit fancier than the last, but if I looked at the type of work they were doing or the type of organizations they were talking from a professional standpoint, they were pretty much, there was so much progress. And it's not that I didn't want to give them a chance, but from an employer point of view, so getting really practical now, it's a risk if I employ somebody who has so much experience, but then is now doing work that does not necessarily commensurate the type of knowledge or expertise they bring. There could be a level of disengagement there, and pay. A lot of people say I'm willing to work for lower pay, but the truth of the matter is they're not, because if they get lower pay, they will be actively looking, or the minute they get the pay that matches their expectations, they're gone, right? So I think that's one of the things that we have to be aware of. That's my viewpoint. Enjoy the mountain you're on, but you have to keep moving so that you don't end up putting yourself at risk professionally. And I think business-wise is the same as well. Like you could be relevant today, you could be absolutely irrelevant tomorrow. The people that love you today, they could hate you tomorrow, or they could love somebody much, much more than you do, much, much more than they love somebody else much, much more than they love you. And it's not that they hate you now, but they just forget you. And I think that's the nature of the world that we live in. And it's finding then, how do we sustain that kind of high performance, high value, but at the same time still keeping ourselves grounded, and we're in for the long run. We don't burn ourselves out in a sprint, but we're able to keep up the pace. I don't know, any thoughts on that? How do we sustain ourselves in this kind of environment and this kind of landscape?
I think like what you mentioned there is really key. The need to also enjoy when you are when you're on the mountaintop, and to be intentional about that. So one thing that we often practice is whenever we achieve something, to market, right? So how do you market? Just like the astronauts on the moon put a flag on it. How do we put a flag on our mountaintop? And that can look like a few things. I think on the very first thing that we often encourage anyone who's leading a team to do, and it seems very simple, but it's a good signal for the team, which is to verbalize that celebration, whether it's through an email reflection, or sometimes we say, we know you guys are busy and you're on the move. At least write a WhatsApp. Put something in the WhatsApp chat to celebrate the achievement, celebrate the team, celebrate your clients as well that have put in all the work to achieve this. So that's the first thing, and we start with that because that's easy to do. You don't have to throw a party. It doesn't cost you anything. It's free, and you can do it in 5 minutes if you just type a message. Use AI, use ChatGPT if you need to, but define the moment. So that's one way. Then the other thing is, obviously you've got to find ways to practically remunerate people as well, because at the end of the day, people, your teams need to know their value, and you can praise them all you want, but there's a certain point at which that sort of verbal praise starts to feel a little empty if there are no practical ways that you are showing your appreciation. And it doesn't necessarily have to be in a monetary sense. It could be by way of a promotion or other things that demonstrate that you are showing value. But these are things that will start to affect, that actually have a practical implication on their lives to make that difference. And I think the reason why it's important to mark those moments is because when we mark the moments, number one, it forces from the leader's perspective, it forces you to properly reflect on what you've done. And actually, when you've been able to spend time reflecting, sometimes that reflection gives you a better sense of what the next thing should be.
Yeah.
Because hopefully in your reflections, you're also talking about things that didn't go so well. You're also calling those things out. And so as you're able to articulate that journey, as you're able to articulate points of feedback as well, then that informs what the next thing should be, or what the next thing shouldn't be. So that's important, but it's also important because sometimes for our teams that are involved, if you're mainly involved in the execution, sometimes it's a bit harder to see the bigger picture of what you're doing. You know, I've been in teams so many times where we've done the work, we've gotten a project over the line, or we've landed an account. I used to work in advertising. You know, we did this long pitch and then we won the account, and we see that the leadership looks really excited about it, but for us it's okay lah, like, you know, that it's only going to be a week before we've got to get on the next one, and so you just end up going through the motions. But I think if we make a habit of defining those moments, it's also a good reminder for those of us who are maybe a bit more in the trenches to be reminded of why we're doing the things that we're doing. You know, we often say that vision and even culture, they leak. So you constantly need to top it up. And if we're not using moments like that to be able to define what our vision is and what our culture is, then great, we hit that mountaintop experience, but by the time we get to the next one, what you probably find is that your teams supporting the work are gradually gonna see their enthusiasm wane over time. And then of course, celebrating through things like remuneration, bonuses lah. You know, one of the things that we have been exploring in Pemandu has been how do we rethink how we incentivize our teams. So prior to the pandemic, we used to have a particular model that was very effective. It was super effective in driving performance. What we used to do is that we essentially had a league table. So like an EPL league table. And we used to have 13 partners in the firm. Now, every partner will be ranked.
Wow.
In that league table. And we would rank them on a very objective metric, which was simply how much revenue are they bringing into the company. So that was great because you have this league table. Now people are incentivized because their names are on that list. You obviously want to be at the top, but you certainly don't want to be at the bottom, because what happens is if you are it's exactly like the EPL. So bottom two, at the end of the year when we do that review, if you're on the bottom two, you get relegated. And then top two performers who are not currently partners, we bring 2 people up. So 2 people get promoted to partner, 2 partners get relegated. And you create this ongoing cycle. And it was amazing. I mean,
was it friendly though? Did they manage to keep the competition friendly?
That is the thing.
That's what
it was friendly for a while. So for the first kind of 3 years or 2 years, I would say, it was friendly.
But you had already established a strong company culture before you implemented that model.
Exactly.
Okay. Yep.
But the problem with that is that even though people were all friends, there comes a point where it starts to become overly competitive, which is what happened. And then it started to breed, not just competition. It probably wasn't so bad within the partners themselves, but actually what started to breed was that all of the supporting teams that were working with these partners you almost start to form camps. And then from there, that's where you started to have some maybe toxic dynamics in the firm. And so 2020, when the pandemic hit, we were forced to right size as an organization. And then we took that as an opportunity to think, okay, how can we just rethink how we do things? And one of the main things that changed was this remuneration structure. So from doing an individual ranking, we scrapped that and we decided to do a team bonus. And so what this meant was that you took away, there was still a degree of competition. There was still a degree of getting buy-in from people because they knew that their contributions had a direct impact on their remuneration package. But we stopped making it about individual contributions and we made it a team contribution. So how this played out was that if you were a team that secured a large project, there will be a certain amount there'll be a set amount of the profit from that will be distributed to the team. And what we would do is that we would distribute it equally. So equal distribution, so that we take away arguments about, oh, but I put in more hours. Because at the end of the day, how do you truly measure that? People can time charge, but people can also lie on their timesheets. So we said, let's not have arguments about this, equal distribution, but how we are then able to remunerate based on those maybe slightly more nuanced things is that we also then offer a code 40 bonus. So then this is where we recognize maybe some individual contributions that may not have been directly tied to revenue, but maybe somebody just showed really, really great leadership in the way that they managed not just the team, but the way they managed and held conversations with clients as well. Those can be recognized as a code 40 bonus separate to this thing. But what we realized it started to do is it really started to foster a sense of collaboration within the teams. But what was also interesting is because now the team knew that our individual, our kind of individual take home, our individual cut from this project was going to come from a pool. It changed the conversation from being about how can we bring more people into the team because this is too much work for me, to actually how can we work more effectively so that we can take more from the pool, essentially. And one of the funniest ways that behavior started to change is whenever we would have international engagements, rather than in the past people saying, let's try to all get business class flights to go to these countries to do the work, everyone was volunteering to say, let's fly economy. let's share a room.
In the cargo deck.
We don't need, I don't need my
takes.
own room, you know? Like we got these like senior directors saying, let's share a room, you know, so that we've just got more to go around. So those have been some of the ways that we have been both monitoring but also encouraging performance as a team.
Talking about competition. Competition is arguably inevitable if you want to be a high performer, because if you think about it, you have to benchmark against something. Now, the ideal or the philosopher would say, well, you are competing against yourself, right? You're trying to make yourself better every day. But yes, that's true. But you still have to benchmark, right? So for example, if I were to look at THX, I'm going to benchmark myself against Game of Impossible because right, you're further along the line and everything. So that gives me a kind of like gauge of how far I should go. But I also might be competing because there's so many podcasts out there. This is an example. Same like in your career. If you're trying to get promoted, there's only so many positions in your company, and then you got to look outside. But then when you look outside, you're also competing against other candidates. So that competition, that competitiveness seems to be going hand in hand with high performance. I don't know, like, is there any way around it? What do you think? Do you have to be competitive, whether naturally or developed, in order to be a high performer? What are your thoughts?
I mean, again, I'm just speaking for myself. I feel what helps me to perform is because I'm naturally competitive.
You say it in such a humble and please don't judge me kind of way, but let's just say you want to win.
And so I think to a degree you have to be.
Yes.
Or you have to, or you, if you don't feel that that's your natural tendency, if you're going to hold a position of leadership in anything, if it's not competition, then at least an awareness or a respect for the competition.
Let me frame it here another way then. Can you be competitive but still likable?
Yes.
How?
So for me, I sometimes feel that my brand of competition, I'm trying to work on being a likable competitor, because maybe it's the same for you as well. But how that plays out is really clear that I would want to win in a certain something. But I do think that you can be competitive and yet still likable, because I think if you struggle with it, you don't find yourself naturally a competitive person, then maybe one way to reframe it is to think, well, how can I respect the competition? How can I see what they're doing well? So you're not taking it you're not looking at it from a standpoint of how can I be better than you, but rather take on a posture of curiosity. Why is this podcast doing so well? And actually using the kind of respect of their success as a driver for maybe some decisions that you might want to take in your own project or in your own podcast. And I feel like if you do that, even without saying you want to be better than that other person, you're naturally going to start improving the way that you do things. And as a byproduct of that, you might surpass the other person, but whatever it is, you still come out better than you were before you decided to pay attention to what they were doing. So I think if people tell me, well, I'm not a competitive person, I say, don't change the framing. Respect the competition. See what they're doing. You don't have to want to beat them to be able to learn from your competition.
Yep, that's really, really, really good insight. And I think another way to be likable and still to be competitive and still likable is to be able to lose graciously.
Absolutely.
Some people are perennial sore losers, right? You know, when they, if they've lost, so to speak, you know, they don't want to admit defeat, or they throw a tantrum, they react, they get angry, that kind of thing. I love this saying, right? Haters will see you walk on water and say you can't swim, you know. And that's the kind of sore loserness that we want to avoid when we are being competitive, because that's again managing our emotions, managing the thoughts that goes behind our emotions. I think the world's big enough. Just because other people are winning doesn't mean you lose. You know, just because other people are winning doesn't mean you can't win. If we have this zero-sum mentality, right, where the opportunities are limited, success is limited, I feel like that is the thought that's actually driving a lot of our emotions and our behaviors in not wanting to be competitive or being too competitive to the point of being brutal to other people, because we maybe feel that things are limited. But I would like to argue that actually the world is a vast place. The way the world has shifted from industrialism to now the digital economy actually shows that opportunities are infinite. They may not be equal in size, but they are equal in number. Plenty of opportunities. And like you said, if you go on that exploratory stage, you can turn a small thing into a big thing. But it's important to actually be willing to try, be willing to compete, but not to the point of being, brutal or murderous, that kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly.
But that's really, really, really. I enjoyed our conversation. We've been. I feel like we are a bit of a philosopher at heart, so both of us. So we can go on and on and on. So I do kind of want to speed things up and wrap up a little bit. So I'll probably ask you this: any final thoughts from you to our audience? We're talking about high performance, managing it, or any pitfalls to look out for.
Maybe one thing that I will just add, I didn't quite articulate it. And this goes back to those three things of how do you kind of figure out what your purpose is to then attach your high performance to. I think being able to actively seek feedback. You were talking earlier about what are the signs to know when it's time to move on to the next peak, or whether even it's to just remain status quo. I think one of the best ways that we figure that out is sometimes not from what we discern ourselves, but actually from the feedback that we hear. And that's why it goes back to why it's important to, as you're trying to figure out what your purpose is, to make sure that there is a communal element to it, that you're benefiting others. Because as you benefit others, as people start to see value in what you do, you naturally create communities around you. And I think as you get those kind of communities, whether they're your clients, whether they are fans, or whether it's just basically a larger team that you have now built, those are great pools actually for gathering feedback. And to the point on, being a sore loser, this has been something that I've had to struggle with, because many times in the past where I have, lost or maybe failed at something, the natural tendency was to want to just kind of almost pretend that didn't happen, to move on, or maybe shift the blame on someone else. But I've realized that in learning how to do the uncomfortable thing of addressing it. And again, it goes back to defining moments. We can also, and we should also define bad moments, moments of failure. In taking time to define those moments, going to speak to people on a one-to-one basis to understand, hey, this thing didn't go so well. But rather than me saying, why didn't you do a good enough job? Can you tell me what maybe I could have done as a leader to do that better? And sure, those conversations are uncomfortable. But I have found time and time again, whenever I've invested time to do that, that has helped me to use your words, to build a little bit of that leadership, that leadership kind of capex and capital, to know that when we go on to the next thing, I know that my team trusts me because I've taken on that feedback and they know that I have good intentions. I can know that when we move on to the next thing, I don't really have to worry about whether they're going to be on board. I know they'll be bought in, and it's because I've taken the time to do the uncomfortable thing of seeking feedback. A lot of our own podcast, a lot of the development has not come from our own ideas on how we should do things differently. It's come from people who've left comments. Obviously, there's some comments that are just nasty comments, which we don't entertain. But there have been so many very constructive pieces of feedback as well from the community. And there are things that we've been able to take action on. And those are things that have helped us to grow. So I think feedback is such an important thing, both being able to give good feedback, but also to receive and seek feedback as well. So I think if you add that to the mix, you'll be willing to take on anything lah.
Brilliant. Well, Leon, it's been a joy and a pleasure. Thank you so much for taking time off your busy schedule and all that you're involved in to be here with us. Really, really appreciate all your insights, and I enjoyed our conversation. The last thing I would like you to do is maybe tell the audience how, what are you up to? Where can they reach you? And
So I have 3 roles. Primarily, my full-time gig is as a pastor of a church. So I look after our leadership development, our creative, as well as our overall services. That takes up most of my time. I'm also the vice chair of Pemandu Associates, a consulting firm. And then the third thing is I do this little hobby of a podcast called Game of Impossible with my dad.
You trying to be likable, right? Little hobby. Don't want to brag too much. Little.
So those are the 3 things. If you want to find out more about the church is called HTBB, which is short for Holy Trinity Bukit Bintang. Pemandu Associates is our consulting firm. We do both consulting for governments internationally, as well as businesses locally, as well as some government projects locally. And then the third thing is the podcast. It's called The Game of Impossible. You can follow us on YouTube or Spotify, and we also have short form content on IG and TikTok at The Game of Impossible.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Leon, for being with us.
Thanks so much for having me, John.
Well, thank you everybody for tuning in to this episode. If you found it helpful, I encourage you to like and to subscribe to our YouTube as well as our Spotify, and follow our Instagram. My name is John, and that is all for this episode of The Human Exchange, or THX. See you next time.